Joined us last week and the week before, and welcome to those who are joining us today for session 3 of the Tools for Increasing Housing Production in Your Community Conference. I'm Carol Marine. I'm a Senior Program Manager at CHAPA. And on behalf of CHAPA and our co-sponsors, Mass Housing, Massachusetts Housing Partnership, the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, Ed Marchant, EHM Real Estate Advisors, and the law offices of Paul Haverty at Blattman, Bobrowski, Haverty, and Silverstein, welcome to this final session of our series on increasing housing production and meeting your housing needs. And thank you to the CHAPA sponsors who will be on our slideshow. As most of you know, CHAPA's mission is to encourage the production and preservation of housing that is affordable to low and moderate income families and individuals, and to foster diverse and sustainable communities through planning and community development. And we certainly hope this conference has provided a forum for sharing tools to develop the field that will seed the expansion of the housing. Today's panel speakers will be approaching housing production with a local lens, how communities are working with community-based organizations, advocates, municipal government, regional partners, development entities to incorporate affordability into housing production and preservation. Katie Lacey, Senior Planner at Massachusetts Housing Partnership, will lead the panel, and she will be joined by some seasoned experts from the private and public sectors who explore pathways to incorporating affordability through the use of inclusionary zoning. But before our panel joins us, we're pleased to present a terrific keynote speaker to open the session with reflections about the Lower Cape community and what they have been able to accomplish through local advocacy and community engagement. And it's a lot. Andrea Aldana, a leader in this engagement effort, wears 2 hats in the housing world. She's the Chief Program Officer at Community Development Partnership located on the Outer Cape. And CHAPA is fortunate that she is also a CHAPA board member. Andrea first joined CDP in 2011 as a volunteer and rose through the ranks to Chief Program Officer. As Chief Program Officer, she sought and seeks opportunities for collaboration and innovation across CDP's extensive programs. In addition to serving on the CHAPA board, Andrea serves on the boards of both Abundant Housing Massachusetts and the Wellfleet Farmers Market. In 2023, CDP was the recipient of MHP's Housing Heroes Award. According to one news report, this nonprofit has expanded and diversified housing opportunities in the Lower Cape Cod region, leveraging ARPA funds, developing resources, and bringing together housing advocates who come from so many backgrounds. The collaboration it took to create the Lower Cape Housing and ADU Resource Center is a great example of the incredible outcomes that can be achieved when housing advocates and government officials work together. And I will add that this was achieved under Andrea's watch. We have invited Andrea to join us and share the story of CDC's successes in creating a diverse coalition that supports a thriving community. Welcome, Andrea, to the Tools Conference.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. This is very exciting. Yes, my name is Andrea Aldana, Chief Program Officer at the Community Development Partnership, and I'm proud to open today's session on behalf of CHAPA and the Lower and Outer Cape communities that we work in. So for folks who aren't familiar, the Community Development Partnership, or CDP for short, is a nonprofit community development corporation serving the 8 towns of the Lower and Outer Cape from Provincetown all the way down to Brewster and Harwich. And we've been around since 1992. We lead the Lower and Outer Cape in building a diverse year-round community of people who can afford to live, work, and thrive here. And to accomplish our mission, we promote, develop, and manage affordable housing. We nurture the launch of small businesses through microloans, education, and technical assistance. And we facilitate regional collaboration with business, nonprofit, and government partners. And as Carol mentioned, and probably of interest to this group, our housing programs also include the implementation of a Lower Cape Housing and ADU Resource Center, which we run in collaboration with a local partner here called the Homeless Prevention Council. And the ADU Resource Center provides technical assistance to property owners who are interested in building an ADU, understanding that the permitting process is not so easy for the average homeowner. And it also educates municipalities about regional barriers to ADU creation that we notice. And we facilitate regional conversations to address these barriers. So please do reach out to me if you want to learn more about that. I won't be getting into that today. Um, and just to share a little bit of extra context for our region, while we're all facing a housing crisis, our flavor of crisis out here is colored by a few extra pressures. So first of all, our housing market is not at all tied to local wages like in most markets. It's really driven by higher off-Cape salaries and people buying vacation homes. And from a zoning perspective, at least 80% of the Cape is zoned exclusively for single family homes, and most towns don't allow multifamily development by right. We also have significant infrastructure limitations, which our other rural communities in the state will appreciate. You know, several of our towns still don't have public water and sewer, including Eastham, where I live. And we also have a hyper seasonal economy. Most people have to make the whole year of income between, Memorial Day and Labor Day, and most of those jobs in the tourism economy are low wage jobs. So all these factors come together to make housing development very expensive and create a huge affordability gap between median home prices and the wages that people make here. So, how did we attempt to mitigate these factors to move the needle on housing production? We created the Lower Cape Community Housing Partnership. So, the Lower Cape Community Housing Partnership is a community based, comprehensive approach to regional capacity building. We're using traditional community organizing and technical assistance to help decision makers make better land use decisions and to help towns meet the housing needs of their residents in three key ways. So, the housing partnership includes three program components. There's number one, a Lower Cape Housing Institute, which I'll get into the details on these next. The Housing Institute is for elected and appointed municipal officials and town staff. And honestly, we modeled it after MHP's annual Housing Institute, noticing that a lot of the people in our communities who are making really important housing decisions were not showing up there. There were some, but not all. And so we thought, well, why don't we bring this type of education to our region and make it easier for folks to engage? So that's the first piece, is the Lower Cape Housing Institute. The second piece is Project 365, which is the latest iteration of our housing advocacy work. And this element is for resident advocates on the ground. We'll talk a little bit about that more as well. And then the third piece is a public education campaign or a media campaign that we developed in the first 2 years of the program. We started in 2017. And the public education campaign is designed to show the real faces and stories of our neighbors who live in or need affordable housing and kind of dispel myths and stereotypes around those. So why did we create it? So I'll dig into a little more about the sort of mechanics of the different program components, but I just think it's kind of interesting to talk through how we arrived at this idea, which is really our CEO, Jay Coburn's idea. So it all started almost 10 years ago, a little less than 10 years ago, with a 40B project that we partnered with a developer on to build over 100 units of affordable housing in the middle of one of the towns that we serve in a very, village oriented, transit oriented location. It was our first development project in a really long time, and we perhaps naively expected the proposal to be well received considering the great housing need. But instead, we faced opposition from the town every step of the way, and very quickly it became clear that affordable housing development is really complicated. Our towns are not familiar with the 40B process, especially if they haven't had a 40B project for a long time or ever. And the people who are tasked with working on housing don't necessarily have the knowledge and skills that you need in order to be able to advance, comprehensive permit process or housing production strategies in general, because essentially these are very well-meaning, very dedicated volunteers who don't necessarily have opportunities or requirements for continuing education. So just like as one example, we even saw a committee member using a clicker by the side of the road to collect traffic data to refute a peer-reviewed traffic study. And so we realized through this experience that our communities just really aren't set up to address our housing crisis, and we're never going to get the thousands of units that we need by continuing on this way. And we also recognize that land use policies are made by both municipal officials and by voters, right? Who ultimately need to approve policies and funding at town meeting. And we needed to support decision makers on both sides of the equation. So We develop strategies to educate town officials about housing production and organize pro-housing advocates who don't typically have the time, energy, or expertise to engage in town government, but who need support to advocate for their own needs. And so throughout our Lower Cape Housing Partnership programming, we're always working toward outcomes in these three areas. Number one, we want to make sure that towns are implementing zoning changes that support affordable housing development. We want to see an increase in the number of affordable units on each town's subsidized housing inventory. And we want to see towns allocating more funding, more local funding for affordable and attainable housing. So let me talk a little bit about the Lower Cape Housing Institute first. This is the first piece of the housing partnership. The Housing Institute trains elected and appointed municipal officials and town staff. We do that through a series of workshops in the off season that equip town officials with the knowledge, resources, skills needed to help their towns create housing opportunities. We also keep an eye on town meeting outcomes so that we can build a narrative around successes. So we summarize housing articles for all of our 8 annual town meetings in the spring and whoever has town meetings in the fall. And then we have a monthly newsletter called Under One Roof that provides detailed town updates to the entire region about everything that each town is working on in regards to housing production. And then we also have peer groups, which is not something that we started with, but something that emerged as a need. These are small, targeted meetings that happen quarterly on a regional basis so that municipal officials can hear what other communities are doing. We learned that a lot of officials don't have relationships with their neighboring towns, and they're not looking for opportunities to coordinate or collaborate and have more efficient resource distribution. So the peer groups have really been an interesting way to both keep on the pulse of what's going on in the region and also provide almost like therapy for town officials to really kind of hash out their challenges and share their successes. So while the Housing Institute provides information about best practices in housing production, it's also created a space for us to help towns craft their messaging about our regional housing challenges and create a regional conversation about how to address zoning, funding, infrastructure, and public support. For example, through the Housing Institute, we've been able to start reframing density as not a bad thing, but as community, and to support alignment between housing folks and open space folks to understand that the way that we support a thriving year-round community who can afford to live here is through dense, energy efficient development in village centers. And the second piece is our public education campaign. So when we started this in 2017, housing discussions in town committee meetings and on annual town meeting floor were frankly nasty. They're classist, explicitly or implicitly racist, and it was still common to encounter people who did not believe that we even have a housing crisis. So in an effort to dispel myths and stereotypes about who lives in or needs affordable housing, we worked with an ad agency to create 6 profiles of real community members who've struggled to find a place to call home and distributed it through a bunch of different pathways. And then finally, our housing advocacy work with residents, which is recently relaunched and re-envisioned as Project 365, is our resident advocacy program. So we're training and empowering year-round residents to engage at a local government level to advocate for the needs of themselves and of our year-round community. And much of that focus is housing. So we also support the town's efforts to develop wastewater infrastructure, for example, initiatives around childcare, transportation, anything that supports the year-round community. But the number one thing that always comes up is housing. And so they really end up being pro-housing groups. And we're developing cohorts over time in all of the 8 towns. This is our 2nd year, so we are doing 2 towns per year, and we're doing 4 out of the 8 towns this year. So have we succeeded? Well, obviously, any of the successes that we have as a region can't be attributed to just one nonprofit. It's very much a collective effort. But we would say that yes, there's a lot of work to do, but we have changed the housing landscape and the housing discourse in our region. For starters, since we started, we've seen our towns allocate over $32 million to housing initiatives. At least half of our towns are having serious discussions about allowing multifamily zoning by right, where it makes sense. Half our towns are getting sewered to allow for increased density in village centers. Several towns have dedicated unrestricted funding to housing or infrastructure, particularly through short-term rental receipts, which are a significant source of revenue out here in our region. And our community engagement tactics helped us get a 40B project permitted in record time without any opposition, which was really an exciting new example of how we can do this faster and better in our region. And we just broke ground on this project in Wellfleet as the residences at Lawrence Hill at 46 units of net zero housing. So I would say, while we are happy to see advances in all of those other buckets, infrastructure, funding, et cetera, that I mentioned, the thing that we're probably most proud of is that when we first started this program, we were looking at a development pipeline of, in the tens. But now we have over 1,000 units in the development pipeline for our region, with every single town in our region working toward a significant large-scale multifamily affordable housing development. And that is incredibly exciting to us. So while we've learned that, yes, communities need tools, need to increase their capacity to be able to meet this moment, we've also learned some other things that are maybe not what we originally set out to support in our region, but have really become important. So one thing that we've learned is that community engagement is super critical at all levels. Clearly, towns need to be engaging in more community engagement with residents and voters, but community engagement also as a tool to build alignment within the town is really critical, because you cannot expect to have residents align around a vision if the town itself can't do so. So we know that education is really important, but really it seems like the workshops and the peer group meetings are providing leadership development more than anything else. We are supporting select boards and committee members to make bold decisions, even if they're not immediately popular, and helping folks articulate a vision for their community to create this alignment in their town. For all of the time and expense and effort, the benefit of cultivating a culture of community engagement is that you start to demonstrate to your residents that you do really want to hear from them. It's not just lip service, right? And when you can demonstrate that you've made decisions based on what you've heard from the community, it becomes much easier to move things forward, and you do have consensus around your vision and projects and values. We clearly have a lot of work to do, and this moment requires bold and courageous municipal leadership at all levels. But we happen to think that community engagement and municipal leadership are the ultimate housing production tools. We think it's the secret sauce that's ultimately going to help us all advance housing production in our communities. And I'd love talking to other organizations that are interested in rolling out similar programs. I've spoken to groups, across 3 different states. So please do reach out if you want to talk through how we've done our work, how we funded it, and how it might work for you.
Andrea, thank you so much for taking us on the Lower Cape's journey from some basics like capacity building through some of your terrific successes. And I would say the numbers speak to your successes, but of course your tools of organizing and engaging are so aligned with what CHAPA does to promote more affordable housing. So thank you so much, and thank you for your willingness to share with other communities. We will make sure everybody has your contact information. And with that, I think we are ready to dive into a specific tool, the inclusionary zoning tool. To address that issue, I would like to turn the camera over to Katie Lacey and her panel.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Andrea. That was absolutely gripping. What an amazing presentation. We have a panel today, a really great panel, to talk about one of the tools local municipalities can take on to increase their affordable housing stock, which is inclusionary zoning. So if I can ask Dave Gasser to put the first slide up, that would be great. I just have a brief introduction. So first things first, what is inclusionary zoning? It's a policy that was developed in the 70s, really, here in Massachusetts, in response to exclusionary and often racially segregated snob zoning. That's the quote. It's a very popular tool, and what it does is gets the private market to subsidize affordable housing. So what you're doing is, and partially this was, if the federal and state government's not paying for it, who's going to? And it moved it onto the back of the private market. So here's a little picture. Next slide, please. A lot of towns get very excited about inclusionary zoning. But I cannot emphasize enough that they are not units, these are homes, and your goal is to get a family or a household in there and keep them there, providing good housing in an opportunity community, hopefully. So it's not, we try not to call them units, they're homes. Now, inclusionary units can be counted on the subsidized housing inventory if approved by, this is old, HLC. And that's one of the main reasons why so many communities get kind of excited about inclusionary zoning. Next slide, please. I'm sure you can't read this, but MHP gets asked all the time to talk to communities about, hey, we want to adopt inclusionary zoning. Sometimes they do it because they want to create more affordable housing. They have a lot of development going on. Sometimes they do it because they see it as a way to stop 40B, which almost never happens. But they all want to know about inclusionary zoning. And you can't read this, but you know, there's certain, it's a recipe for an inclusionary zoning bylaw. How much affordability are you going to require? Are you going to require it townwide? Are you going to require it in certain districts? When does your threshold start? Does it start at 6 units, 7 units, 8 units? Are you going to have a payment in lieu? So we created this little worksheet for communities to go through, and we frequently get groups that are just, you know, debating each one of these points, really attending to it. And then it gets passed, hopefully, at town meeting, and everyone's so excited, and then they go away. And if we can have the next slide, please. Unfortunately, what we found is that by and large, these efforts are not that successful. MHP had an opportunity, an unusual opportunity, to participate in a nationwide survey of inclusionary, they called it inclusionary housing all across the nation. MHP was selected to do it was all done by 1 or 2 consultants. Massachusetts had to get its own consultant because we're so complicated. We have so many more jurisdictions than any other state in the country. And as it turned out, we have more IZ provisions than any other state in the United States. Unfortunately, we have less inclusionary units than any other state in the United States. So of the ones that have it. So there's a real disconnect here. And in fact, through this study, we found that over 60% of communities that had inclusionary zoning have not produced a single unit. So if we can just have the next slide, and that's my last. I wanted to talk today about the next steps, okay? You want inclusionary zoning, that's great. But I always encourage communities to kind of envision the outcome. So what is going to happen once you get it on your books, which is a fantastic accomplishment? And the pitfalls I see over the years are eligibility. So getting them onto the subsidized housing inventory. People want these to count and they want them to stay affordable. How do you do that? You know, you got to think through that. What's the process? So and then the next one is, how do you keep them on the SHI? So monitoring, who is watching the store? You've got rental units, you've got home ownership units. Who's in charge? You know, who's keeping track of them? But the biggest question I think we see is getting them built. And this is largely boiling down to financial feasibility. I always have that little picture of eggs in my mind, the dozen eggs, because you know, I think housing, inclusionary zoning and housing is one of the few areas where we expect someone who's selling a product, say a dozen eggs, if you said, yeah, I'd like those, but for the price of 9 eggs, please. You wouldn't get through the checkout line at the supermarket. So, you know, we're kind of asking to developers to do the same thing, and it has to be worth their while. So we're super lucky. Oh, and one thing, with MBTA community zoning law now in place, which will conceivably, hopefully, add a lot of units to some communities, there's just been like a geometric increase in the number of communities expressing interest in inclusionary zoning. So it just seemed like a good moment to take a deep breath and talk about these pitfalls and how you're going to kind of address them. So we're really lucky to have Ali Sabatino, who's the LAU coordinator at HLC, who's going to talk to us about that. How do you get them on the SHI? We have David Cashman at SEB, who's a senior project manager, who's going to help us work through what happens once they're on, who's watching them. Alexis Smith is the principal housing planner at MAPC, which is the regional planning agency for Greater Boston, and has done just a tremendous amount of work looking at financial feasibility. And then finally, Matt Lanza, who's the executive director of planning and development for the city of Everett, is going to kind of bring it all home with a case study of how they are really succeeding in Everett in using their inclusionary zoning. So I'm going to turn it over first to Ali. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katie. That was really a wonderful intro into what we're talking about today. So my name is Ali Sabatino, and I'm the Local Action Unit Coordinator here at the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities. So David, if you could advance the slide, please. Thank you. So what is LIP, or the Local Initiative Program? This falls under Chapter 40B, and it's a program that encourages locally driven efforts to create affordable housing. So what does that mean? Basically, if the municipality is engaged and supportive of the development before it comes into us, that is, really what the Local Initiative Program is all about. Next slide, please. So there are two types of LIP projects. If you can think of LIP as kind of an umbrella, and then there's two different types of programs that are under the LIP umbrella, or the Local Initiative Program. We love our acronyms here. There is a friendly 40B, that's what most people call it, but that's also called a comprehensive permit, or LIP 40B. And if you were here for the first session, my director, Rieko Hayashi, did a great discussion on that, and you can always go back and take a look if you want to learn more about that. But today we're going to talk about the Local Action Unit section of the LIP program. And basically, if affordable units are generated through inclusionary zoning approvals, sometimes CPA funds that are designated at town meeting, they would come through the Local Action Unit program, the affordable units, for eventual inclusion on the subsidized housing inventory. So basically how I think of it is this program is like a catch-all for local zoning approvals that require affordable units that are not 40B. So if you can, next slide, please. So what are some examples of LIP projects? We literally have everything. We have new construction, we have building conversion, we have rehab, large and small rental and home ownership. We have nonprofit like Habitat sponsored projects. We have first-time home buyer buy-down projects. So we really run the gamut here through this program. And we just crunched the numbers the other day, and we had 8,000 units come through us in the last 2 years, which I think is a huge number. And that really is a testament to the local community and local municipal support, going to town meeting, fighting the good fight, getting inclusionary zoning passed that actually really works. So I think that's a really an exciting stat that we have. Next slide, please. So Local Action Unit application process. What do I need to submit for this application? So some of the key requirements that we have is the application submitted by the municipality. And just like the title of the program is Local Action, we really want to see the municipal support through this application. So the application has to be signed by the municipality and then obviously the developer as well. Evidence of local action. So I'll go into more detail as we progress in the slides what a local action is. Basically, it's any type of local approval. So if it's an inclusionary zoning, if you have an inclusionary zoning bylaw and you have a special permit that requires affordable units, that would be a local action. Or a site plan approval that would require affordable units, that's a local action. CPA funds that designate a certain amount of money towards affordable units, that would be a local action. Anything really on the municipal level that shows support and approval of affordable units. Affirmative fair housing marketing and lottery plan You know, a lot of people just think that, you know, the lottery needs to happen. You put a lot of names in a bucket and pull them out, but it is much more detailed than that. And we do require one of those in this application. And I'll go through in more detail what is actually required in these plans. But I just wanted to point that out as it is a specific, and I think the most, time consuming piece of this application. We also require a regulatory agreement, which is the long-term use restriction. That's for both ownership projects and rental projects. And we do require it in perpetuity, the affordability restriction. Next slide, please. So what are some examples of local actions that are eligible? So I'm really trying to hammer this point home. So anything that's zoning-based approvals, a special permit, or other discretionary zoning such as site plan approval as of right, things like that. We also, another example is conveyance of publicly owned land, or as I said before, CPA funds that go to an affordable development. And there is a little caveat down here. We do sometimes see in the application, if it's a special permit, it doesn't specifically, or a site plan, you know, any kind of decision from the local municipality. Sometimes it doesn't say, you know, we require 2 affordable units. So I just like to point out that is something that we do like to see in the decision, so that we know that the municipality has approved it. Next slide, please. Okay, so there is an obligation. We have an obligation to affirmatively further fair housing. And if you did not attend the last session of this workshop, I would strongly suggest that you go back and take a look at that meeting, because I thought it was really well done and really went into this in, you know, much more detail. But we do have an obligation to provide maximum opportunities for people who are protected under fair housing laws, and this is done through marketing, application process, and selection procedures. And I'll go into what that means in more detail in the next slide. So what needs to be in this marketing plan that's required? Again, people think, you know, sometimes you just put the names, you know, in a bucket, pull it out one by one, and whoever wins is the winner, but of the units. But it really is much more than that. So some of the contents in the marketing plan is description of marketing and outreach. So how are you going to reach future tenants, future homeowners? How are you going to put out that you have this affordable opportunity out there? Sample ads and publications, we like to see, you know, and review what is going to go on those. Application materials, what is the information that these future applicants are going to have to give you and provide? Information materials. So basically, you know, what is the information that you are going to put out there for this housing opportunity? Eligibility requirements, are you a first-time home buyer? Do you meet our, you know, income and asset requirements? Lottery and resident selection procedures, how are you going to conduct the lottery, hold the lottery, and then ultimately select your residents? And if there's a local preference, we require a clear description of the preference used. We do allow up to 70% local preference that is, you know, requested by the municipality at the time of application submittal. And I just do like to point out that it is for rental. The local preference is only for initial lease up. So I just also like to put that out there, because some people, you know, think that it's an ongoing thing, but it's only for initial lease up. So next slide, please. Okay, the subsidized housing inventory, or the SHI. Again, we love our acronyms here. So what is the SHI? The SHI is the number of the subsidized or affordable units in each community and that percentage. So you'll hear a lot like, oh, we need to get over 10% on our SHI. So basically, once we review the LAU application, it comes in and we approve it, those units can be eligible for the subsidized housing inventory, to be counted on the subsidized housing inventory. And so the units generally count on the inventory if they're developed under an eligible state or federal subsidy program. So the LAU program, the local action unit program that we're discussing today, is an eligible state subsidy program. They have to be affordable to households at or below 80% of area median income. They have to have a long-term use restriction. So that's like the regulatory agreement that I was talking about before, that's in perpetuity, and are subject to an affirmative fair housing, marketing, and resident selection plan, which I was just talking about before. So next slide, please. I like to include this slide because we always get questions about this, because it is kind of like a little interesting. But I do like to put it out there because I think it's important for everyone to kind of know and understand. So what is counted on the SHI? So for rental units, if at least 25% of the units are at 80% AMI or area median income and below, or at least 20% are at 50% area median income or below, all the units, and they meet obviously LIP criteria, then all the units count on your SHI. And obviously, if there are fewer than those numbers, only the affordable ones will count. So if you have like 10% or 5% affordable, only those will count. And then for ownership, only the affordable units in the development will count, and obviously meeting LIP criteria. Next slide, please. So this is just some contact information, because obviously that's a lot of information, and I'm sure people have very specific questions, if not project specific questions. So here's our contact information. Please reach out anytime. I also did include Margot Leclerc on here as well. She oversees the subsidized housing inventory. I know that there are many questions about that, like where am I on the list, the subsidized housing inventory list, where is my municipality or town, what percentage do we have? So I've included her contact information as well here. Next slide, please. This is the last one. This is just some resources. We have our LIP website here, which has the application and all the materials, and then obviously the SHI website as well, which shows, has information and shows the percentage each municipality is at. So with that, I'll hand it back to Katie. Thank you.
Thanks, Allie. That was terrific. And what you just said about 8,000 new units coming through the program blew my mind, because that is really a lot. I mean, that's a lot, like more than has ever been on there before, practically. Anyway, I'm going to pass it over to David Cashman, who works for SEB and works with this stuff all the time.
Hello, everyone. My name is David Cashman. I'm with SEB Housing. We're a lottery and compliance agency based in Needham. And I'm really sorry, but they are taking down a tree right outside my office. So the best laid plans have gone to waste. There's nothing I can do about it, but I hope it won't be too distracting. The topics I'd like to talk about today are, and Allie and Katie touched on some of these, but I hope to offer a few additional nuggets. Who does the local action unit application get submitted to, and what does that approval process look like in practice? Is marketing in a lottery required? Is local preference allowed? And what oversight functions does the municipality have both during the lottery and afterwards? Next slide, please, Dave. So the first topic is, who does the LAU package get submitted to, and what is that approval process? Well, in the vast majority of cases, the LAU gets prepared by the developer or their agent when we get hired by developers, and that's who hires us, is the developers, not the towns, not HLC. We prepare it for them, and we first submit it to the municipality for approval. Ultimately, it needs to be signed by the mayor in a city or the board of select persons in a town, but that doesn't mean that those are the people that I'm typically interacting with. In fact, I almost always am interacting with someone from the planning department, and they're the ones who are looking at it and asking questions or suggesting revisions. And then ultimately, they would pass it along with their stamp of approval to the mayor or the board of select persons for signature. And it does need to be signed before the package is then passed along to HLC for review. Ultimately, once HLC reviews it and approves it, the regulatory agreement, which Allie mentioned, and that's sort of your chief legal document that governs the project and the affordable units within it, and specifies the different parties' rights and obligations. This needs to be signed by all the different parties. So first it gets signed by the developer, then actually they have to have their bank who has a mortgage on the property typically sign one page as well, subordinating their loan to make sure that the affordability provisions stay there in perpetuity, even in cases of foreclosure. Then the town or city signs it. Ultimately, HLC signs it, and then the developer records it. Next slide, please. Is marketing and a lottery required? Yes, if you want to get it on the subsidized housing inventory. And the specifics of how that looks, and Ali touched on some of this, are contained in the Affirmative Fair Housing Marketing Plan, the AFHMP, which is part of the Local Action Unit application. The municipality has the right to be notified when marketing starts. And that's something that when we get hired by developers and we do the marketing and the lottery, we always send a notice to the municipality at the start with the information packet and application that will be disseminated publicly and to applicants. And that begins a required 60-day marketing and application period. And if a group like ours is involved, and there are others who do the same work as well, we're typically the face, and we're the ones interacting with applicants, collecting applications, answering questions, and ultimately building a database to be used in the public lottery, which typically follows the application deadline by 10 days to 14 days. That public lottery is almost always done virtually now. And it's important to note, because if you're in a municipality and you might get these questions, and I know people in municipalities do because they ask me, people will say, like, who wins and who loses, right? Because when you say the word lottery, everyone just instinctually thinks, well, there's winners and there's losers, but that's not true. In these lotteries, what they do is we essentially establish a waiting list for every unit type that the development has. And they often have different types. They have studios, 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms, and very occasionally 4 bedrooms. Some people apply for some units and not others, and not everyone qualifies for every unit type. So the lottery is used to establish waiting lists, which in turn establish an order of priority for the folks on the waiting list, which dictates if and when they're likely to get an invitation from the leasing office to apply for a lease, or if they're going to get an invitation from the sales team to reserve a home and move forward in the home buying process. But nobody wins and nobody loses. Everyone who's eligible for the lottery is in the lottery and will have a position on a waiting list. It's just a question of if and when they're going to get invited forward. Next slide, please, Dave. So local preference, this comes up all the time, I'd say, in the vast majority of projects we work on in the inclusionary zoning, or even if they forget to mention it, the town says, yes, of course we want a local preference for those who live here. As Ali said, it's allowed for up to 70% of the units, not more than that. Sometimes we get into these rounding issues and you have to round down so you don't have more than 70%. And importantly, the municipality has to justify it. It's not sufficient to just say, hey, we want local preference in this lottery without more. That's not going to get you there. What you have to do is put together a letter that justifies why it's warranted. And typically the contents of that letter touch on facts such as the dearth of affordable housing in the municipality, the number of residents who are cost burdened, the delta between market rate and affordable rents or sales prices. It might talk about the number of households who are on waiting lists for Section 8 vouchers or the like. I can't speak for other lottery groups, but if we're involved and you work for a municipality and we confront the situation, you can always reach out to us, and we have examples, template examples that we'd be happy to share. And you could say, okay, these seem to be the sort of touch points I have to hit on. Obviously, I have to adjust them for your specific municipality for the letter. And I think in general, I don't want to talk out of turn. I don't think HLC is looking to deny local preference letters, but they do just have to check that box and show that the justification was there. There are 4 categories that are allowable: residents, employees who work in the municipality or municipal employees, and parents with kids attending local schools. It's not uncommon that I'll see a municipality want to include some of these and not others, or they want to include additional ones that aren't within these 4. In my experience with HLC, it's got to be all four. It can't be more than that. It can't be less than that. Now, important point, how does the local preference actually work in a lottery? So you can have up to 70% of the units with a local preference attached to it, but that doesn't mean that only local preference households can get those units. And in fact, they often might not. And that's because when we do a lottery, there are various considerations we have to take into account when building the waiting list. There are priority categories. Local preference is one such category, but so is household size for larger units, because we want to make sure that households, like a household size of 1, isn't occupying a 3-bedroom unit when there are other households in the lottery, families of 4, 5, 6 persons who really need the 3 bedrooms, whereas the one person might just like the 3-bedroom. So local preference, like household size, is but one factor in establishing the waiting list. But say if we're talking about a 3-bedroom unit, a 1-person local preference household is not going to be higher on the waiting list for that unit than a family of 5 who comes from a different town and doesn't have local preference, because that household size is a weightier factor. So I think some towns have this misconception that local preference only means local preference and only local households will get those units, and that's not true. It just means that as compared to similarly situated households, the local preference household would be higher on the waiting list. Next slide, please, Dave. So this is an important one. So municipal monitoring during the application and lottery period. I would start out by saying nothing is necessarily required of you. This is more your right. And to the extent you want to, if you're work for the municipality, this is your decision about to what extent you want to pursue this. But I think you absolutely have the right to be advised when marketing starts. And we always advise municipalities when marketing is up and going, and we share the materials. If they want, the municipality has the right to confirm that the marketing was conducted in line with the affirmative fair housing marketing plan that they already reviewed and approved. So they could say, hey, Dave, you said you were going to advertise in these 4 newspapers. Do you mind showing me the tear sheet that you actually did it? Dave, you said you were going to place ads in these online forums. Can you show me that you actually did it? You said you were going to reach out to these community members. Did you do that? That's totally fair game. You don't have to, but you could if you wanted to. You can also request updates throughout the application and lottery period. And that does happen sometimes, not often, but you could say, Dave, you know, how many applicants are you getting for this lottery? How many of local preference? Can you give us some demographic data? And of course, the lottery itself is public. If you want to show up, absolutely, you can. Next slide, please. I want to talk a little bit about municipal monitoring that happens after the lottery period. And this one's important, I think, because I think most municipalities, certainly not all, there's certainly some that have a lot of affordable housing and they really know kind of and take an active role in ongoing oversight and engagement with the affordable units. But I think many municipalities think, okay, you know, we passed this zoning, they're building this affordable development or development with affordable units. They ran the lottery, they filled some units, kind of our job is done. That's not really the case. In the regulatory agreement that you'll sign, and I've put the language here, but it essentially says that you have, as the town, you're the monitoring agent, you're the reporter. And every year you're supposed to get a compliance report from the property, which demonstrates to you that the affordable units continue to be occupied by people who qualify and at affordable rates. And then you are supposed to certify to HLC that you've reviewed that, and in fact, the property is in compliance. Now, it's important to note, you're probably not going to get prompted to do this. Now, with the properties that we work with, we remind them every year of this obligation. But if they don't do it and you work for the municipality, don't expect that someone's going to call you or email you and say, hey, have you collected this compliance report? Because it may not happen. So it's something that the municipality has to be a little bit on top of. And it shouldn't be too hard. Set a yearly calendar reminder in February to say, hey, where's that compliance report? What's in the compliance report? Dave, next slide, please. So in order to sort of demonstrate to you and then for you to certify to HLC that the regulatory agreement is being complied with, here are some elements that I think you should look for in the report. So you could be looking at, I want to see the unit number. I want to see how many bedrooms is in it. What's the name of the tenant and what's their income? When did they last demonstrate their eligibility by doing a certification or a recertification? What's their household size? What's their rent? When did their lease start and when does it end? When did they first move in and do they have parking? The level of detail that you go into as a municipality is at your discretion. Okay, you could take that at face value and say, we've reviewed the report and all looks well. You know, we see that the people are under the income limits and the rent appears to be what we approved it to be, and other elements are being followed. You could take it a step further and say, that looks good. Could you send us a few files actually and a couple leases for these 5 random tenants? We just want to be sure that it is what you say it is, not just what it is on paper. Some towns even hire third-party groups to do these audits for them. So how you treat this is sort of your discretion. I guess it depends on, you know, sort of the level of comfort you want to have with if it's, you know, being maintained the way it's supposed to be maintained. But what you don't want to have happen, and which does happen sometimes, is years go by, no reports have been submitted. The property is getting sold and the buyer says, okay, where are these reports that says they have to do? And everyone goes, I don't know, they haven't been submitted in 5 years. That doesn't look so good. And if you know, if you're the municipality, you obviously care, you want the affordable units to go to the people who need them. So I would think this is something you'd want to do to make sure that the, you know, the ownership group isn't charging way more than they're supposed to be, or hasn't totally abdicated their responsibility to carry out their obligations under the regulatory agreement and make sure that the units go to the folks that they're intended to. Next slide, please. I won't spend a lot of time on this. There's not enough time, but just quickly, you know, these are hypothetical, totally made up names and details. And, you know, this would be a project that has 2 affordable units. Often it'll be way more than that. But I just italicized the second one, you know, Dan White, again, totally made up. Tenant income, 172,000. That's more than you're ever going to be allowed to make to qualify for an affordable unit at 80% or less. And that would be a red flag if you're reviewing this as a municipality saying, hey, what's Dan White doing in that unit? He makes too much money. And also, Dan White last certified on November 6th, but he started his lease on October 1st. What's going on there? That doesn't seem timely. That's not necessarily evidence of something being done wrong. Sometimes it does take a while to get people to comply, but it would warrant a question at least. Next and last slide. And I'll just touch quickly on this one. You know, for ownership units, there is also continuing obligations on the part of the municipality to make sure that the regulatory agreement is being complied with. And I think the biggest one there is you just want to make sure that the eligible applicant is still living there and they haven't sold it without going through the proper channels, and that they're not renting it out and living somewhere else. And how you want to go about that, I think you have some discretion over. It could just be having them sign something. It could be having them submit proof of residence, you know, submit a gas bill, electricity bill, what have you. So you have some leeway there how you want to satisfy yourself that that's being done. And I think we'll have time for question and answers later, so I will stop there because I know I'm out of time.
That was full of info. Thank you. That was just terrific. I'm going to move right along to Alexis, the Principal Housing Planner at MAPC. Why don't you take it away there, Alexis?
Yes, thanks everyone. We're going to continue the trend of some very dense information packed into a short period of time. But Dave, if you could bring the slides up, please. All right, so I am going to talk about Katie's last point from the introduction. You know, how do you make sure that your inclusionary zoning policy is something that actually is going to work, and that, you know, affordable units are going to be built through it. Next slide, please. So a lot of what I do at MAPC, and excuse me, I work for MAPC, which is the regional planning agency for Greater Boston. And our approach to doing financial feasibility analyses for inclusionary policies is essentially to make sure that the municipality is maximizing the community benefit, or in other words, asking for as much affordability as it can, either in terms of number of affordable units or depth of the income level those units are serving, while at the same time, on the flip side of that, making sure that the project remains feasible. In other words, that it actually happens. The next slide, please. And so in order to understand that, I'm going to go through kind of a simplified version of the analysis that we do to determine, like, you know, what can a municipality ask for? Next slide, please. So very, very basic overview. When a developer comes into a municipality and wants to build a project, they sit down and look at a whole slew of different things, which in the developer's documentation will be hundreds of thousands of numbers. But here we're kind of distilling that down to the basic principles of what it costs to build housing, which is, if you look at the bottom half of that house diagram, it's, you know, what it costs to physically build the housing, to buy the land, to hire a contractor, to pay an architect to do the drawings. And all of that is encapsulated in what is in a construction loan, which is given by a bank and by equity investors who kind of front the remainder of what the bank can't cover. So that's getting the project to exist in the first place. And then once it exists, you got to run the thing. And so that is on an annual basis. You've got to pay people to rent out and lease the units. You have to plow perform maintenance, plow the snow, trim the trees, pay property taxes to the municipality, keep building up a reserve account for when larger repairs are needed. So all of these things go into what it costs to build and maintain housing. Next slide. And all of that has to be supported by project income, which is almost entirely, the vast majority of that is rents from the residential units or commercial units if it's mixed use. Sometimes a development project will charge for parking. In older buildings, you might see laundry fees coming in, although that's less common in new buildings. But the bulk of a project income is through its rents. And the basic premise is that a project has to bring in more in income than it expends in costs. Same way that any of us would run our own household budgets. We cannot spend more than we earn in our monthly paycheck. Next slide, please. And so in order, again, this I got ahead of myself here, but a project has to earn more than, bring in more in revenue than it spends on its costs. Next slide. And so inclusionary zoning comes into this because inclusionary zoning effectively means that a project has less income coming in. The affordable rents are, unless you're in a kind of weird outlier community, in general, the affordable rents are going to be lower than what a developer could ask in terms of market rents. And so there's going to be less money coming in. But the key here is that the costs don't change. Aside from, you may have slightly, less nice finishes in an affordable unit, but in general, like, it costs the same amount of money to build a foundation for an affordable unit as it does for market rate units. Land costs the same, getting an architect on board costs the same amount of money. And so really you're seeing that difference in the income, but not in the costs. Next slide, please. So the issue is, most projects can handle some degree of affordability, even if it's less than what, it would be seeing in market rate. But the issue arises when the affordability makes up so much of the project rents that all of a sudden the project is bringing in less in rental income than it is accruing in project costs. And at that point, the developer said, developer is gaming all of this out before the project is built. And if they anticipate that that's something that's going to happen, then they walk. They look up to other municipalities, they look for a different site, but that is something that they're not going to move forward with. In the same way that you wouldn't accept a job that paid less than what your rent or mortgage was. Next slide, please. And so that was all kind of high level conceptual. I'm going to do a very, very, very simplified version of this with all the caveats, but just to kind of put some numbers on it so folks actually get a sense of what we're talking about here. So let's say, for an example, we have a 20-unit project, all one-bedroom units for the sake of simplicity in Greater Boston. So corresponding to Greater Boston affordable rents. Starting from the bottom again, the project costs, let's say it's in somewhere in suburban Boston and the costs are $400,000 a unit development costs. That's, I would say on the low end for Greater Boston and on the high end elsewhere in the state. So $400,000 per unit times 20 units, that's $8 million is what it costs to build this thing. Working backwards from that, that equals roughly $550,000 total in essentially the mortgage payment. This is where it's very, very simplified. Equity payments are a lot more complicated, but just for the sake of this example, I'm going to look at this essentially as like, all right, you take it out an $8 million loan from the bank. Every year you got to pay the bank back $550,000. And so then the next piece from that, and so that's just what it's cost to pay back the money that the bank lent you to build the building. On top of that, every year the developer has to pay for the operating costs, the snow plowing, the maintenance, all of that. A good rule of thumb for that, a common number for that is $10,000 per unit per year. So again, 10,000 times 20 units, we've got $20,000, $200,000 total for the operating costs. So if you add those two together, every year the project expenses are that total of that, which is $750,000 annually. Next slide. Now, if you look at project income, let's say a market rate unit in this area, in this municipality for 1 bedroom goes for $3,250 a month. Again, we're looking at something in the, outer Boston sub area, on the kind of the periphery of Greater Boston, but not too far out from the inner core. That's what the developer sets, but anticipates they can earn in rent. The project can earn in rent. The affordability levels are determined essentially by HUD. The Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development sets the income levels for the region based on a household earning 80% of area median income, 60% of area median income, et cetera. All of that based on saying, all right, we think that this household can pay 30% of their income towards rent. And so that's how you kind of work backwards into those rent costs. Next slide, please. And so this is where it's gonna we start to look at what the impacts of that are. That blue bar is again going back to the project costs. In order to pay back the loan and to keep the lights on in the snow cloud, the project has to pay $750,000 a year. Now, if we're looking at entirely market rate units, all 20 of the units in that building going for $3,250 a month. That's great. Developers in great shape. They're bringing in way more money than they're having to pay out every year. Good to go. If we look at even adding just 10% of units at 80% of area that are affordable to 80% of area median income, that actually has a, when you look at $20,000 hit to a project earning $780,000 a year, it doesn't sound like much, but when you start to look at what the actual margins are, it's it's a fair amount of money. But still, the blue bar horizontally across the chart shows, a plus or minus margin of error. Some developers might be able to get a little bit less than $10,000 a unit operating costs, whatever else. It's a little fudging since this is an estimate. But so you get 10% of units at 80% AMI, and that's still well within kind of a developer's likely comfort level. You start adding on more affordability. All right, well, let's look at, can we ask for 15% of units at 80% AMI? Again, kind of below that $750,000 threshold, but still probably, maybe the developer can cut down on construction costs here to reduce that mortgage, or, cut down on operating costs. Same thing with 10% of units at 60% AMI, like probably, maybe doable. But then you start to see what happens if you go beyond, if you keep adding additional affordability. 15% of units at 60% of area median income, 15% of units at 50% of area median income. Even though when you look at it and say, all right, well, $720 compared to $720,000 in income compared to $780,000 in income, like, on paper, it doesn't seem like that much until you bring in you start to think about the project costs as well. And all of this is relative to the project costs. And so municipalities just need to be aware that their developers are dealing in real numbers. These aren't hypothetical, like you can just keep throwing money and taking losses from affordable units. So next slide, please. So what can we do? Lots. Next slide. Municipalities can either boost the amount of project income to ask for a greater degree of affordability. That is most commonly seen through density bonuses, could also be through a height bonus. A lot of municipalities that are subject to the MBTA Communities Act are seeing that they can ask for some additional affordability, because when you start talking about 15 units an acre by right, that's worth a lot. And so, you know, in some of these Section 3 districts, there might be additional affordability that you could see. Next slide, please. The second way municipalities can help, you know, if they really want to ask for greater affordability, they can reduce costs. And a big way to do that is by reducing parking minimums, parking minimums. Parking costs, a structured parking space costs like $40,000 a space right now, and that gets tacked directly onto the cost of the unit. And so that is a real concrete way that municipalities can reduce costs, and which again is in the service of enabling them to ask for more affordability. Next slide, please. So I and my colleagues at MAPC have been doing a lot of these analyses lately as part of the MBTA community to help municipalities with MBTA communities compliance. And we've got a couple of high-level takeaways from this work that we've done in the past year. Next slide. I'll run through these very quickly. In general, municipalities can ask, there's a lot of leeway to ask for more than 10% of units at 80% of AMI. So if your goal is to really increase affordability in your community, I would encourage you to look at, you know, beyond that number. Particularly one of the ways that you can achieve that is by reducing on-site parking requirements or by increasing height or density. Another big takeaway is that if you want to maximize the affordability you're getting across all projects, I'm a huge fan of increasing project requirements as project size increases. What a 200 unit project can support in terms of affordability is a lot higher than what a 10 unit project that's just, you know, built by the guy who lives around the corner can support. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind, because you don't want to see only those 200 unit developments. You want to support the guy building from around the corner building a 10 unit project as well. A lot of suburban municipalities that are seeing primarily subdivision development or single family development, where inclusionary zoning kind of has a hard time getting traction. Those that are looking at multifamily housing can ask for more beyond what you would typically see working in a single family development. And finally, if you take only one point away from this, it should be that municipalities really need to juggle their priorities. As much as I would love to see super deep affordability and mixed use and parks and all of that, municipalities can't have everything. If your priority is affordability, then you may have to give leeway on building height, on open space, on contributions to other funds. And if something like that is your priority, then you may have to ask for less affordability. So really it's all about a balancing act, but I encourage folks to think about it at a deeper level, because it's important to get as much affordability as you can when you're seeing development happen in your area, much like Matt will be seeing.
That was amazing. That was the clearest explanation of that I've ever heard. So thank you. Yeah, and then we'll bring it home with Matt talking about what's going on in Everett, which is amazing. So go ahead, Matt. Matt is the planning director and city solicitor for the city of Everett.
Assistant city solicitor. I won't take the full title. Hey everyone, my name is Matt Latanzi, and I am going to be talking as a case study about the city of Everett and our inclusionary zoning policy and linkage fee policy. So you can go to the next slide, please. So starting off with inclusionary zoning, next slide. So it was back in 2017 that the city of Everett first codified our citywide inclusionary zoning ordinance. So this is not limited to just a specific area in the city, it is citywide. Our inclusionary zoning ordinance requires that any project that results in 10 or more units in the aggregate to deed restrict a minimum of 15% of the total units as affordable in accordance with EOHLC standards, that being that 80% AMI. And I do just want to pause here to talk about that term aggregate. So that means if it's a new project that has 10 or more units, that is going to fall under the requirements of inclusionary zoning. But also if there's an existing, say, 8-unit project that wants to add 4 additional units, neither of those are a 10-unit project, but in the aggregate, it results in 10 or more units. And therefore 15%, not just of the added units, but of the total units of that now 12-unit project, always rounded up, will be inclusionary zoning units. So there is a discretionary reduction built into our ordinance that 10% of the units can be deed restricted as affordable if the project requires an extensive amount of environmental remediation, is located in a FEMA floodplain, and/or has a recorded AUL on the site. This is due to the fact that there's a lot of increased costs when it comes to some parcels of land if they have those types of issues that they have to combat with. And I will say too that when it was originally passed, this was a non-discretionary automatic reduction to 5%. In the last year, we have increased that to a discretionary 10% reduction. Next slide. So we've permitted a lot of housing, and a lot of that housing is affordable. A lot of it's market rate. So we've produced over 4,500 units of housing in the past 5 or 6 years now, with 624. And honestly, I should have waited until last night to submit this. It says 624 are affordable, with 33 presently before the planning board for review. We actually approved another 8 affordable units last night, with an additional 11 being introduced this morning for a new project. So, still producing a lot of housing and keeping it around that 10 to 15% affordable for all of these projects. Next slide. So these are the 3 big considerations that we have been facing, and it's an ongoing issue that we continue to talk about. So the first is the percentages required. Now, as I had said, we in Everett have a 15% with a discretionary reduction to 10%, and it's set at 80% AMI. As you'll be able to see through any type of economic feasibility analysis, those percentages, they can vary significantly between city to city, town to town, where you're situated. So I do like the idea of having some type of discretion so that you can treat projects differently, because not all projects are the exact same. Some of the construction costs, the remediation costs, they vary significantly. So having a variation in your affordability is important. Another thing is, do you allow offsiting or do you allow in lieu of payments? We do not allow in lieu of payments whatsoever. We do allow offsiting technically. We've actually not exercised that and actively discourage it. One thing with inclusionary zoning that you don't want to see is a segregation of a lower income or affordable unit. You want to see them integrated into projects. Now, that said, there have been some conversations that have been had where some developers do wish to offsite either a portion of or the entirety of their affordable unit commitment or requirement. The conversations that we've had are essentially, if you do that, you're going to have to either increase the total percentage offsite. So if you were required to do, say, 15 units in a 100-unit project to be deed restricted as affordable, if you want to offsite those, maybe it's 20 units that you're responsible for, or maybe it's 15 units, but at a deeper affordability. And then the last is the area median income. So really where you set that 80% AMI or lower, that's very important. And it's very specific to your area. So our area in Everett, we are part of Middlesex County. Middlesex County is one of the wealthiest counties in America. Everett is not one of the wealthiest municipalities in America. So the average median income for a household size of 1 in Middlesex County is an astonishing $114,000. And that's because, again, they have some of the wealthiest municipalities in Middlesex County. Everett's AMI, on the other hand, for a family of 1 or a household size of 1 is $55,000. So it's less than half. So even at that 80% AMI, while it is considered affordable, it's not Everett affordable. So that is something that we're constantly talking about how to address best, while being able to attain affordable housing for our residents, while at the same time not dissuading projects from moving forward or making it impossible for them to move forward on a financial basis. Next slide, please. So the other thing we're going to talk about is the linkage fee ordinance. Next slide. So we did a study back in 2018 for a linkage nexus study, and we have implemented our first linkage fee ordinance in 2021. And how this works is that a linkage fee payment is required prior to an issuance of a certificate of occupancy. It's a payment made by a developer, and they are required to pay 10% of the total amount that they owe when they apply for a certificate of occupancy, with the remaining 90% to be paid over a period of 3 years. When it was originally passed, that period was 7 years and it's since been reduced to 3 years. I'm very thankful for that. And the rationale behind kind of front or backloading the majority of that payment is that we understand that you have to make money as a developer. You have to have revenues coming in. So that 10% at CO, that is not a significant payment typically. But as the revenues start coming in and these projects are making money, that's when we can justifiably expect them to actually pay back that 90% over a period of 3 years. And some of them change or vary about how they want to pay it. Some of them want to just kind of get it off of their books and have a majority, maybe 50% paid on that first year, and then spread out the payments over the term of 3 years. Some of them prefer it more heavily on the back end so that it's maybe 10% at CO, 15, 20% over the first 2 years, and then the remainder at that third year. Next slide. So what do we do? When does linkage fee kick in? So this is any new building or structure that results in one or more new residential units. That's for residential projects. Any addition to an existing building or structure that results in an increase in the number of residential units. So again, that example of an 8-unit project doing a modification, either interior or exterior, that results in more units. And then any non-residential building or structure that will result in greater than 15,000 square feet of gross floor area. And any addition to an existing non-residential building that will result in the aggregate of 15 or more than 15,000 square feet in gross floor area. Next slide. So how do we calculate these fees? For the residential, it's really easy, $1,000 a unit. And that's for new units. So in that example of an 8-unit project that's adding 4 units, it's only those additional 4 units that are required to pay a linkage fee. So that would be $4,000. They would be expected to pay 10% upfront, so $400 to get a CO, and then over the next 3 years, pay down that remaining $3,600, split up $1,200 a year. That's impactful. That we get a good amount of money from smaller projects, but it's those really large projects, those 500, 600, 700 unit projects that are contributing a majority of our linkage fees. But with the commercial industrial, it gets a little bit more confusing with the numbers. So again, it's only at 15,000 square feet or greater. So every square foot of gross square footage up to $30,000, each square foot is responsible for $2 to the linkage fee payment. Every gross square foot between 30,000 and 60,000 is $3 per square foot. And then it's $4 per square foot at 60 or anything over 60,000. So an example I gave is 34 Market Street in Everett is an Amazon warehouse. It's 221,800 square feet. So those first 30,000 square feet at $2 is $60,000 in total linkage, $3 per square foot for that 30 to 60. So that's 90,000. And then $4 per square foot for all the square footage above 60,000. So that totals 647,196 for a total of roughly $800,000. Now they were grandfathered in under the old payment schedule of 7 years. So they are paying essentially $100,000 a year over 7 years. Next slide. So what do we use the linkage fees for? The linkage fees are paid into the planning department. We have an affordable housing coordinator who is responsible for collection and then ultimate expenditure of those fees. And they are very limited in scope of what we can actually utilize those funds for. So it's solely used for improving the existing affordable housing stock through rehabilitation of structures. So that's for existing deed restricted affordable housing that we can do exterior or interior modifications, changes to brighten them up. A lot of these housing stocks, they've been online for a really long time. And even if they're not decrepit, they're at least worn. So we do want to rehab those, make them look nice, make them much more livable. It's never the goal to make affordable housing less housing. It's not supposed to be less than the market rate housing. It should be on par and everything should be equal. So that's one use of the linkage fee. Another one is to increase the affordable housing stock through new construction and or land acquisition. And I'll actually get into an example of that on the next slide. And then the last is to deepen the affordability of existing affordable housing stock. So as Alexis was saying, that there is a strong possibility that deepening affordability or giving a greater percentage of affordable housing, that can make a project not work. It doesn't pencil out all the time. And that's just a real thing. It's not just developers being greedy. Finances are finances. So we can use those fees to either reduce that AMI required to say 60 or 50%, or we can increase the percentage from 15% to 20% of the total units, and any mix in between. Next slide, please. So this is my final slide, and this is an example of our usage of linkage fees. So taking that 34 Market Street example of having $800,000 coming in, some of those 700 unit projects that we've approved and are seeing COs go out for, we've collected quite a bit. So this is 25 Garvey Street. It's an awesome project in the city of Everett. It's 125 units of affordable and deeply affordable housing. It's 100% affordable. And those units are between 30 and 60% AMI with an emphasis on family housing units, so predominantly 2 and 3 bedroom units. The city is going to contribute $2,750,000 to the construction of this project, including the land acquisition. And these are all funds that are generated through linkage fees. So this is not, I mean, it is technically public funds, but they're not raised from public tax dollars. And it's a little bit different than a CPA or a Community Preservation Act in that, again, it's not a citywide tax. It's not borne by the residents. It's borne entirely and solely by developers coming into the city. So we have been able to raise a significant amount of money and actually expend it on projects that will have direct benefits to Everett residents and other residents throughout the Commonwealth. We do exercise that 70% local preference. So we are hopeful that of the 125 units, roughly 90 to 100 will be going toward existing Everett residents, with the understanding too that this is it's not just a regional problem, not just a state problem, but a nationwide problem. So, building housing of all types, but especially affordable housing, has a huge impact, and it's a much needed thing in our state. So that's it for me. Thank you very much.
These have been amazing presentations. Carol, I think we have time. We're going to have a moderated discussion for what, about 15 minutes, you think? And then we want to leave time for questions from the audience.
I think that's great.
Okay. I'm going to start with Matt. I hate doing that because everyone did, but before we get communities going, yay, we're going to get 600 units of inclusionary zoning next year. One thing I did want to ask you is, you've obviously had a very high level of production in Everett going on, but also what does your density look like? Like, what kind of building heights are you allowing citywide? What kind of levels of density are you allowing that might be resulting in this kind of result?
Yeah, so it varies by area. And actually, we're going through a zoning recodification right now to better right size our building, our height allowability, FAR allowability throughout business districts and whatnot. But a vast majority of these units that have been permitted are in what we call the commercial triangle, which in 2017 or maybe 16 was rezoned to accommodate much larger housing projects. So down in the commercial triangle, it is 7 stories by right for all mixed use projects, an FAR of six with a special permit to go up to 8. The height of 7 stories or 85 feet can go up to 100 feet. And then, as Alexis was saying too about some trade-offs, we have a citywide TDM or Transportation Demand Management Ordinance where we have gotten rid of parking minimums, but instead of just getting them off the books, so instead of just getting them off the books, which is what some municipalities do, we have done what essentially is a credit and debit system where we still have on the books what our minimums are without enforcing it. So if a 200 unit project would be required to have, say, 300 parking spaces, 1.5 spaces per unit, we're going to actively encourage that you do not deliver that. We don't want to see that many cars in Everett adding congestion. And again, it's a lot of cost on the developer that they have to make up in some fashion. So we allow that reduction in parking, and with trade-offs, some having to do solely with transportation, so that they run free shuttles from their site to an MBTA station, that they provide Blue Bike memberships and Blue Bike stations. Those are some of the things, but then also some community benefits. So that can be additional publicly available open space in excess of what's required, and even having affordable units, inclusionary zoning in excess of what's required, will get you credits to make up for those debits of your reduced parking count.
Thanks. That is amazing, but basically dense is what we're talking
Yes,
about here.
very dense.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna switch back to the beginning. Allie, I wanted to just ask you, we get questions, if there is state or federal funds in a project, let's say it's a tax credit project or what have you, can it go through the local action unit program?
So that's great. Thank you. That's a great question. So, if it has state funds in there, like a tax credit or something like that, it would not come through the program. It would go directly through the program that you're getting the financial subsidy under. So if it was mass housing, you would go through mass housing. Tax credits from the state, you would go through their program. So it's really, we're a program that kind of is, like I said, a catch-all. But it's basically, if it's not funded by another state entity. But if you do receive funds directly, from the federal government, like, sometimes there's home funds that come right from the federal government, that would still technically need a state subsidy in order to get on the subsidized housing inventory. And so that would come through the local action unit program because there is no, state subsidy there. It's directly from the federal government. So it is a little.
It's interesting. So they're different.
They're different, yes.
Yeah. And then just real quick, more on local action units. Do a certain percentage of the units in a project have to be affordable to get a LIP, to be eligible for a LIP application? I mean, a LAU application?
Yeah, so unlike 40B, which requires, a certain percentage of your units to be affordable, we do not have a certain requirement for the number of affordable units in the development. It can be, we've seen anywhere from, 100% affordable units in the development, or 10%, I think is probably the most common that we see, but it really all depends on what, is in the community's bylaw.
Wow. And speaking of percentages, Alexis, I wanted to ask you a question we frequently get about inclusionary zoning is, wait a sec, if a 40B project can require 25% affordability, why are you telling me it's not feasible for an inclusionary zoning project?
I think there's two main reasons there. The first is that, as you all know, a 40B project can skirt local zoning regulations. So it can, height is a huge thing, but density as well, front rear yard setbacks, parking, all of that is the developer is kind of dictating the terms on that, and that makes a really big difference because they're dictating the terms under the assumption of that 25% affordability, as opposed to the town or the municipality saying this is what we actually really want to see. So one is the developer being able to, having the leeway to not be subject to the local zoning regulations, and two is the size of a lot of 40B projects. It is rare to see a small 40B. A lot of 40Bs are in the 60 units, 100 units, 200 unit range. And, a lot of small local developers just don't operate at that range, and also don't have the savviness to go after a 40B project. It is an insane amount of savviness required to get something like that permitted. And it's these smaller projects that really have a hard time meeting the 25%. As I mentioned before, a lot of the costs are the same no matter how big the project is, and a big project can share those costs among all of the units. 10-unit project is sharing those costs among far fewer units, and so it's just a lot harder to make higher affordability percentages work. But in a lot of municipalities, it's those small 10-unit projects that you actually want to see. Those are the local developers, and those are the missing middle scale projects that actually fit with a lot of town centers. And so I would say if you do want to ask for those higher percentages, it might be possible for 100-unit projects, but it's almost never possible for a 10-unit project.
I'm just going to stay with Alexis for one more question right now. Another big issue we run into with communities is they say, send us some good IZ bylaws from neighboring communities that work. And we always discourage that, and people say, why? You know, what if it's working in X town, why isn't it going to work in my town? So how would you respond to that kind of question?
I think also two reasons for that one. One is housing markets are can be very hyper localized. And so even though construction costs are pretty reasonable or pretty regional and don't vary a lot from municipality to municipality, rents do. And so what you could be asking for in rent in one municipality, even if it's only a couple $100 a month higher, as I saw from the previous slide, a couple $100 a month times several units actually can make a big difference. And the second, probably more important reason is that zoning across municipalities is not equal. And if an inclusionary zoning policy is working next door, there's a good chance that it's because that municipality has the heights and density allowances in the underlying zoning to accommodate that. If a municipality allows 5 stories and the municipality next door only allows 3 stories, what works in the 5-story municipality is not going to work in the 3-story municipality. And I guess the third reason is that, we'll leave it at that. We'll leave it at that.
Well, I'm going to add another one, which is that, many neighboring communities, one will have sewer and one won't.
Yeah.
Now, sewer is
thank you.
never free. People should always know that. Even if the town has sewer, you're paying a lot of I&I to hook into it. But it is still less expensive if the sewer is pre-existing. And similar with water. And we have a lot of communities in the greater Boston area where it's this patchwork of who has that and who doesn't. I'm going to switch to Dave. So how does an organization like SEB get involved? So who are you working for, and do you work for municipalities? Do you work for developers?
Yeah, we get hired by the developers actually. So that's who we work for, but we have a lot of interaction with the municipality, and we have a ton of interaction with the applicants for the affordable units. So we're sort of the face for that. But we, are happy to answer questions from municipality, to work collaboratively with them to make sure that the marketing and lottery process, obviously there are very clear guidelines on what needs to happen, but a municipality could say, hey, Dave, your marketing plan doesn't touch these people or these groups. We'd like to see you add those, and that's great. We're happy to include that and want it to reflect their vision as well.
And how much involvement do you typically see from a municipality in terms of monitoring local action units?
Yeah, it really varies. It runs the gamut from like, what is this and why are you asking me about it? And what is this report you sent to me and why did you send it? And what am I supposed to do with it? To, every year on the same date requesting it and having a third party get in there and audit files. So it really runs the gamut, and I think sort of understandably and predictably, towns that have more experience with it tend to be more involved, and ones that are newer to it, less involvement. But I think once they sort of see how it works and have a few reps, there's a certain comfort that happens, and we see more questions and suggestions and overall involvement.
I can see a lot of good questions coming in, so I'm going to just ask a few more questions. Alexis, one thing that's come up particularly with the MBTA communities is, what is the impact of a requiring mixed use in a project that also has requirement for affordability? How can that impact the project cost, since you conceivably are having a business on the ground floor and collecting rent from them? So how does that work?
It can be very substantial. In a large project where you might be doing like a new, luxury lifestyle center or whatever else, if you have the the commercial tenants lined up 2 years ahead of time, then you're not going to have a problem with that. That's going to work. But that's not most ground floor mixed use, especially in smaller town centers or main streets. The way the financing timeline works is a developer's going to get that mortgage 2 years before the building's going to be occupied. And there are very few, if any, small businesses that are going to occupy 1,000 square foot space that know 2 years ahead of time that they're going to want to occupy that space and are willing to sign a lease for it. And because that's not something that you can get on board and front load 2 years ahead of time, many banks will look at those spaces and say, we're not willing to take on the risk of that commercial space. And many banks and lenders will require that developers assume full vacancy, at least for the first couple of years for that commercial space. And you see this happening where, if the residential units up above are fully occupied, and even on like a pretty vibrant main street, there's often a ground floor commercial space in a new building that just hasn't found the right tenant yet. And that's a hit to the bottom line, especially in the first few years when a project is getting up and running. And so that's one of those areas where, if getting ground floor commercial use is very, very high on a municipality's priority list, then that is totally understandable, but it means that you might have to be more flexible on your affordability requirements, or vice versa. If affordability is a high priority, then the municipality might need to be a little bit more flexible on that mixed use requirement.
Okay, well, I think we'll wrap with that. There's some, I thought the panel was amazing, but our questions are almost as nerdy as the panelists, right? So I don't know how this works, Carol. I can't really see if people are raising their hand.
Why don't I repeat a couple of the questions that did not get answered? Some did.
That would be great.
I'll start from the back. Yeah, and a couple questions about monitoring, and one from Andrea Donlin, and I think Rieko started to answer this, but maybe Dave or you want to add to it. From Franklin Regional County, what municipal agency or board typically does monitoring if not done by a third party?
Typically, it would be someone from the planning department, in my experience. I mean, it's really up to the municipality, but that's sort of who I've seen.
I agree with you.
And are you seeing more and more that, I mean, I think Rieko put in the chat, there is a list of mass housing approved agents. You're one, CHAP is one. That may be the way we're going to. Let me see the next one. Dave Madden asked a question and he had his hand up. This, I believe, is to Alexis. Does MAPC have data on the development impact of higher inclusionary zoning requirements in Boston and Cambridge? The narrative is that they've stalled new development. Granted, we're in a stalled development moment generally, but is there a good rule of thumb for percentage requirements in high demand cities?
The short and I assume very unsatisfactory answer is that no, there's not a good rule of thumb, to the extent that even within the same municipality, I recommend that municipalities go back and revisit their inclusionary zoning studies every 5 years and update them, because markets change. Rents increase faster or slower than construction costs. In that Cambridge, Boston, Somerville all do revisit their ordinances pretty regularly. I have not done any analysis of Boston or Cambridge's, so I can't speak to those generally. I do know that for a long time, Cambridge's life sciences industry was offsetting its pretty progressive inclusionary requirements. And when you talk about cost offsets, that was one way that was working. I unfortunately can't speak to the specific municipalities, but I get it's so different from one town to another, from one city to another. It's really hard to generalize.
Actually, I'm going to just ask Matt one more question.
Please.
Because this reminded me. So what are you anticipating in terms of linkage fees to be collected in the next, say, 5 years?
Yeah,
Because
so
I thought that was interesting how you could actually subsidize or, or lower rents.
yeah, so some of those projects are, those approved projects that are already in a payment schedule. And then there will be new projects that pay that initial 10% with the remaining 30% year over year. We're expecting over the next 5 years about $4 to $5 million in additional linkage fees coming in.
Okay. Okay, Carol, onwards.
Good. That's a lot. Sukanya asked, and this may be to Ally or others, hoping to learn more about the leverage that municipalities have to negotiate rent increases in LAUs beyond just adhering to the AMI limit terms, knowing that the HUD AMA may not reflect the on-ground median income. Curious if tying those increases to cost of living would be feasible. Good question.
Yeah, so, as you just discussed, normally we do, allow up to the, maximum AMI, 30% of 80% or whatever percentage AMI the units are, approved for. But we have seen increasingly municipalities pushing back on rent increases, requesting, 5%, only 5% increase, a 10% increase, depending on the, large jump with that AMI calculation. And to be honest, we have pleasantly surprised, I'm pleasantly surprised most developers have been understanding and okay with that limitation. And I'm sure Dave probably can also kind of chime in on this, but we have seen municipalities push back. And I actually also have seen in, some regulatory agreements that have come in, I have seen limitations of a 5% increase per year, which is more stringent than what our regulatory agreement has now. And so I do think there is some flexibility there, but again, everyone has to be in agreement with that. But I think that's a great question.
And it's so hard as a monitoring agent at CHAPA, we see how difficult it is for tenants on fixed incomes at many of our projects. Before we jump to the next one, I just wanted to circle back to Andrea briefly, because Katie, you had mentioned the cost of sewer and how demanding that is. Andrea, I assume that's a big issue on many of the Cape communities that you have been involved with.
Yeah, of course. I mean, funding is a limitation, but also, longstanding anti-development sentiment is probably the bigger barrier than the funding. I can't speak too much to this. Our CEO might be online here to chime in, but what I can say is that one of the things that we've been really advocating for towns to do is to allocate their short-term rental receipts to housing production. And so what some towns are doing is allocating some or all for sewer. And so, infrastructure is housing production adjacent, and we're supportive of that, but that's how we're seeing some towns handle it.
Great, thank
I
you.
see Jay is raising his hand.
Oh, Jay, please. Yeah.
Sure, I could just add that.
Thank you.
So the project that Andrea talked about in Wellfleet, the town actually decided to tackle a wastewater treatment plant that would serve the 46 units that were being constructed on town land, as well as the elementary school across the street and the public safety facilities that are just down the street, and potentially a small neighborhood that's in a very nitrogen and phosphorus sensitive area. That allowed the town to unlock $3.5 million in MassWorks funding, as well as funding from the Cape and Islands Water Protection Fund, in addition to the state's revolving loan fund. So having the municipality play a key role in leveraging public investment of that infrastructure made the numbers work much more successfully on the affordable housing units.
Thank you. It's that ever expanding capital stack.
Correct, yes.
Thank you both. Going back to monitoring, a question from Andrew Herlihy, City of Haverhill. A less expensive way in which to conduct affordable housing lotteries would be very beneficial. Hear, hear. The cost of running a lottery for 2 units versus 200 does not have any significant economy of scale and roughly the same costs. Small project developers don't want to pay agencies for such lotteries as LAU units, but then they don't end up on the SHI. Are there agencies offering to conduct small unit lotteries at lower costs? I don't know if that's Ally in your, maybe you have a comment on that.
Yeah, so I mean, I agree with you, definitely, and I think it probably is, a huge issue. We do, there are agencies out there that have ready renter plans that could cost less money. But I'm probably not qualified to tell you, how much or anything like that. So I don't know if maybe Dave wants to comment on, that, but I agree. It's a great issue that you bring up.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have a perfect answer to that, Andrew. It's a valid complaint. I mean, from the perspective of the agency like us doing the lottery, there isn't, there's that sort of same issue where we have to go through all the same steps, and we might get, tons of applicants for 2 units. And so it's still a lot of work that needs to be compensated. But there are a few groups that do it, and so I guess you can kind of shop it around and see if someone has a price that works for you. But I don't disagree. 2 units is sort of it's just a tough sort of size to make it work for everyone, and I don't have a sort of better answer than that.
These are questions that hopefully will come up more and more, and we'll start to see some ideas about addressing them. I think there are 2 more, and then we'll wrap. Tom asked, question for Matt. It was my understanding that Mass municipalities cannot implement linkage fees unless they are designed to compensate the government costs caused by the developer, and that they can't be used to raise revenues generally. However, this is long. It sounds like revenues raised through Everett's linkage fees are being used for expenses unrelated to the developer. And he's asking, how is Everett able to justify that? And, this may be an offline answer that we follow up with later, and we can get back to you, but do you want to
I'll take a
stab
crack
at that?
Yeah.
Okay,
So, we did perform that linkage fee nexus study, which I'm happy to provide the entirety of that study, the RFP that we put out. I'll provide all the material for that, kind of from our very beginning until the final product that was actually produced and introduced to the council. What I believe precipitated the whole conversation was Encore Boston Harbor coming in. That development was expected to result in a drastic increase in the housing costs. And it did. I mean, we saw a massive increase in housing costs, again, in Greater Boston, but in Everett specifically. So I was not involved. I wasn't with the city at the time that we commenced that study nor finished that study, but I do have all of the information for it, which I'll share with Carol and whomever else, and we can share it around.
Great, thank you. And Matt, I think the last question is for you also, from Eric Salerno. It just flew off my screen. Hold on. How is the operation and maintenance at 25 Garvey going to be subsidized? So we'll end up going back to that great project that you mentioned.
Yeah, so presumably the operation and maintenance of the affordable units and keeping them affordable, or I just want to make sure that I'm understanding the question properly.
Eric, if you're still on.
In my office, can you hear me through this mic?
We sure can.
Okay. Yeah, it was mostly just with the ongoing operation. So similar to the calculations that Alexis was showing in terms of the overall business plan for, running rental property. When you have reduced revenues due to the affordability of those units, I was not so much concerned, but wondering how it worked out with regards to ensuring that property can continue to be cash flow positive.
Gotcha. So I think Alexis brought it up earlier that these projects, they're incredibly complicated. And it sucks to say, but it's really the players who have been involved in many of these projects before are the ones who continue to be involved because that learning curve is crazy high. There are a lot of subsidizing agencies that are involved with these types of projects. So while the city of Everett is providing linkage fees, that is certainly not the only funding that is going into this project. There are state tax credits, bonds. They've applied for funding through, we have a consortium, the North Suburban Consortium, that provided direct funding to this. So there are tens of millions of dollars going toward this project from various agencies to ensure that it is cash flow positive, understanding that it is so deeply affordable. Without a significant investment from the locality and the state, there's no way that that project could ever get funded.
And I should clarify that the ongoing operating and maintenance costs of a typical market rate development that is financed through traditional mechanisms and just has a small percentage of affordable units is a very different animal from a fully affordable building like the one that Matt's talking about. They presumably have access to low-income housing tax credits, which is a very complicated financing system that partners affordable housing developers with big corporations seeking to offset their tax liability. And they presumably, to hit those 30% AMI units, also have access to project-based housing vouchers from the state and the federal government, which makes up the difference in operating income from those lower rents to be something that the project can, actually, so the project can stay functional.
Well, I think that's a good place to wrap. This has been an incredible discussion. Clearly, it's complicated and there are many options. Let me once again thank Andrea, Katie, and Matt, Alexis, Allie, and Dave for your expertise and sharing your time with us. It's a lot, and I'm happy to tell you that we will provide recordings, we will provide PowerPoints, and we will provide resources. So if you didn't take copious notes or you have more questions, that's all fine. This wraps for the 3 sessions. Thank you for joining. Please stay involved with CHAPA. I did put a quick 4 question survey in the chat. I hope you can fill it out. And go to chapa.org, join our committees, join our young professional group, just stay involved with us. And we look forward to continuing the conversation and working together to create more affordable housing. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Carol.